A long time ago, I was asked what my favorite species to study is. A common enough question for a xenoanthropologist, I suppose. I answered very simply, my favorite was then, is now, and always will be. Humanity. The young woman who asked me the question that made me realize that was the granddaughter of my first human friend. And the way she asked that question, every intonation, tone use, word choice, everything was identical to her grandfather. A grandfather she never even met. That man's name was Matthew. We met in an upper-class preschool on Mars. His parents and mine were both diplomats stationed there and happened to pick the same preschool since we all lived within a block of the place. Now I'm not human, obviously. I'm an Athean. We grow and mature over the same time frame as humanity, but our adult stage lasts for approximately 5 human lifespans before we reach what would be considered old by our standards. Because of this long lifespan, 3 times that of any other galactic species, Athenians rarely make friends outside their species. The heartbreak of knowing you'll outlive them is often too great. But especially so, our species avoids humans. My father sat me down when he found out my best friend was a human and told me that he'd support the friendship, but didn't think it was a good idea. However, I was 4. I wasn't thinking of any of that because I didn't know it at the time. I was just happy to have a friend I had so much in common with. We grew up together, occasional class clowns, occasional nerds, one-time cricket stars, but always, always together. My father and mother were respectful of Matthew, but never participated in anything unless they had to, and often made flimsy excuses as to why they couldn't attend gatherings where he or his family would be there. It wasn't until we got far into our post-college careers that I began to realize what the friendship would become, how long I would outlive them. I'd live until Matthew was forgotten by all but myself, but seemingly he wouldn't be forgotten by the universe. By age 28, Matthew had a wife and child, Penny and Sebastian. Matthew would often comment on how similar Sebastian looked to his father at that age. But as Sebastian grew, it was his behavior I became fascinated by. Athenians are blessed, or some would say cursed, with perfect recall. Every moment of our lives from birth to death is able to be remembered flawlessly down to minute details. Almost everything Sebastian did was a mirror of his father. That same head tilt when he was looking at something he didn't understand, the same giggle when he pulled a prank, the same way of talking when he was confident of his own point. As Matthew and Penny had more children, I saw more of it. Michaela had his swagger-like walk and his big grin that showed off all his teeth. Lila inherited his habit of grinding his front teeth into his lower lip when deep in thought. Even Terence began tapping out the same rhythm Matthew does when he gets bored, the only remnant of a childhood song his father and I had created that no one remembered anymore. But it was Patricia that fascinated me most because she inherited habits not from her father, but from her grandfather. Matthew's father had died of a stroke shortly after Lila was born, and yet this little girl who had never known her grandfather outside of stories walked like him, talked like him, walked like him, laughed like him. Into her teenage years, she'd develop a love of the same bands I remember her grandfather playing on the speakers whenever I went to visit Matthew. It was like watching someone be reborn into another body. It sadly broke her grandmother. To see reborn the man she loved since childhood just crushed her in a way that is hard to describe or understand. Patricia wasn't a perfect copy, and the differences made it all the worse for the poor woman. I remember once when Matthew and I went to visit his grandmother, he had to step out to take a work call. She asked me if I saw it in Patricia too, and I just nodded. She asked me to never tell Matthew, but said she couldn't be around her granddaughter anymore. She loved her, but every time Patricia laughed or used the same odd turns of phrases as the woman's late love, she could do very little else but try not to weep. It was so strange. To my knowledge, I had no habits from my parents or ancestors. Maybe that was because I wasn't surrounded by them like Matthew and his children. But even then, Patricia never knew her grandfather yet, was a walking copy of the man in many ways. I started noticing it more and more among our friends, soon realizing that it was only the humans. Their children came to resemble their parents in both body and habits in many ways. You'd look into a child's face and see their mother's eyes watching you, smiling their grandfather's wide, crooked grin, doing that strange ear tug you remember their father doing whenever he had something on his mind he didn't want to talk about. Even artificially made children were not immune from this. Louis and Stephen had a designer child made from both their DNA, and they too had elements from family members they never met, family members I could recall from our childhood days, but had died 30 years before their kid was brought into being. And yet, there they were again, reborn into new flesh, those same habits and expressions. I realized one day, after a few decades of being fascinated by the phenomenon, of writing my PhD dissertation on the subject, this was why IFians avoided humanity. You couldn't just befriend the person. Your long lifespan meant you'd inevitably befriend their families and be uncles or godparents to their children, and then their grandchildren. It was bad enough knowing you'd outlive the person, but to know you'd outlive them until the very knowledge of them was lost. Until so many centuries had passed, even their gravestone was battered by time, and the elements as to become unreadable. But their presence would linger. The universe couldn't let it die. Their eyes, their grin, their laugh, their habits passed down through generations until it feels like they were haunting your steps. And then every so often, you get someone who looks, sounds, and acts like an almost perfect copy of your long-dead friend, and it breaks you in a way you can never express and humans will never understand. One of the current descendants of Matthew is a replica of the man that could have almost been made in a laboratory, and I have to avoid him lest I break into tears. He will never know this unless he reads these words, and I pray he doesn't, because despite me being unable to look upon the man, I wish him nothing but the best of times in his comparatively short life. Every human you meet will laugh the same, scream the same, and grieve the same as someone probably long dead, and to befriend them is to be able to remember that person and see it reflected. Humans are living histories of those that came before, their features and habits passed down through generations, a beautiful and horrible thing for those of us with the lifespan and memory to recall the dead. All of them are chaotic and energetic and fun, and desire nothing but loved ones to experience the universe with, and every new generation brings something new to study, something you've never seen before in so many ways. But should you befriend them, you will be doomed to see the one you loved everywhere you look, even after their very name has been forgotten by everyone else but you. Cherish the days you have with your human friends, for in time they will come to break you as reflections of them dog your steps until you can do naught but sob for the memories you have, as I now sob for Matthew.